There is a generation of young men right now who are breaking their bones to be more attractive. Not metaphorically, literally. They are researching surgical procedures to alter their jaw structure. They are injecting substances into their faces. They are tracking their caloric intake to the decimal point, studying the geometric symmetry of their reflection for hours, cataloging every asymmetry, measuring every angle, in pursuit of becoming more physically desirable. The culture has a name for this. It's called Looksmaxxing, and the culture is alarmed. Mainstream media is alarmed. Parents are alarmed. Health professionals are alarmed. They are writing articles about body dysmorphia and eating disorders, and the psychological toll this movement is taking on an entire generation of young men. But none of them are asking the right question. The right question is not, why are these young men doing dangerous things to their appearance? The right question is this: what kind of emptiness does a man have to carry inside himself before he decides that his face is the problem? Because that question is not a question about vanity. It is a question about identity. And the answer to that question tells you everything you need to know about where men are right now and where they need to go. That if I looked like a man who had his life together, I would eventually become one. It never worked that way. Not through the mirror. The mirror cannot give you what it doesn't have. And when I think about what these young men are doing right now, the looksmaxxing, the obsessive tracking, the hours spent analyzing angles, I don't see vanity. I see that bathroom. I see a generation of men standing at a mirror, asking a question the mirror cannot answer. I was 20 years old. I was standing in front of a mirror in a bathroom that wasn't mine. I was in a US Navy barracks, and I found myself standing there longer than I should have been. Not preparing for anything, not getting ready for work or a conversation that mattered. Just standing there, studying myself, cataloging what I saw, measuring the face in front of me against some invisible standard I couldn't have named if you'd asked me to. I had grown up without a consistent male presence in my life. My father was a concept more than a person in those years, present in theory, absent in the ways that form you. And what that kind of absence does to a young man is something I didn't understand until much later. It doesn't just deprive you of skill sets or practical guidance. It leaves you without a framework for who you are, without someone to hold up a clear picture of manhood, to say by word and by example, this is what a man is, this is what he does, this is what makes him worth something. You start constructing that picture yourself from whatever materials the world provides. And what the world provided to me, as it provides to most young men today, was the surface layer of things. What men looked like, what they had, what kind of presence did they project. So I stood at that mirror, trying to solve a problem I hadn't named yet. The problem wasn't my appearance. The problem was that I didn't know who I was. And I was hoping, in a way I couldn't have articulated then, that if I could just get the outside right, the inside would follow. The Looksmaxxing movement did not emerge out of nowhere. It is not simply vanity that went viral on a platform. It is the predictable output of a specific kind of cultural collapse. For most of the 20th century, masculine identity in America was anchored to a set of visible external structures: a trade, a vocation, a family that required your provision and protection, a community that knew your name and held you accountable, a faith tradition that gave you language for what you were for, not just what you were capable of. These structures were imperfect. They carried their own rigidity, their own failures, their own blind spots. But they gave a man something foundational, a place to stand, a framework for identity that existed outside of himself and required something from him, a way of knowing he had arrived, not because of how he looked, but because of what he was doing, who he was responsible to, and what he was building. That framework has largely collapsed. The stable career ladder has given way to a gig economy where stability is the exception and progression is unclear. Homeownership for men under 40 has become increasingly out of reach. Marriage rates are declining. Fatherhood is being delayed. The milestones that once told a man, you are established, you have done the thing, you have a place in the world, are either gone, restructured, or redefined to the point of meaninglessness. And when a man loses his external framework for identity, he does not sit with the emptiness. He fills it. He finds a proxy. For some men, the proxy is status, the relentless accumulation of markers that other men will recognize. For others, it is domination, what gets called the red pill, which teaches a man to measure his worth by how many people he controls, intimidates, or outmaneuvers. For others, the proxy is the body itself, the physique, the face, the jaw, because when everything else feels uncertain and out of reach, the body is one of the last things a man believes he can actually control. Most of the young men in this movement are not narcissists. They are not shallow. They are men in pain who have found what appears to be a concrete, measurable, achievable path to transformation. They have been told, by the algorithm, by the culture, by the ambient message of the world around them, that the answer is in there. If they fix what they see, they will become what they need. What no one has told them, what the culture cannot tell them, because the culture has forgotten this, is that the thing they are looking for has never lived in the mirror. Identity is not appearance. Character is not aesthetics. A man's worth is not denominated in the symmetry of his face. And no amount of jawline optimization will fill the space inside a man where his sense of self is supposed to live. That is the actual crisis, not the dangerous practices. Those are symptoms. The crisis is that an entire generation of men is trying to answer a spiritual question with a physical solution, and it will never work. Not because they are broken, but because they are building in the wrong place. So what does a man build identity on? This is the question the culture refuses to answer clearly, because the culture has a stake in keeping men in a perpetual state of optimization. An insecure man is a consuming man. He buys, he clicks, he subscribes to the thing that promises he will finally be enough. A man who knows who he is does not need what the culture is selling. The first thing a man must understand is that identity is not discovered, it is constructed. You do not find out who you are the way you find a lost object. Identity is the cumulative weight of repeated choices, held commitments, and survived difficulty. It is built, slowly, through action, through consistency, through the compounding of small decisions made over time, usually without applause. A man who rises at the same hour every morning for a year, not because someone is watching, not because there's an external consequence if he doesn't, but because he has decided that this is what his mornings will look like, has built something real into himself. Not merely a habit, but a kind of self-respect that compounds. A man who keeps his word when it costs him something, who holds a boundary when yielding would be easier, who chooses discomfort because he understands where the comfortable path leads. That man is doing the actual work of becoming someone, and the man he is becoming is recognizable, stable, able to be counted on. Then comes the harder work. Identity requires something to be in service of. A man who builds himself for himself alone will always end up circling back to the mirror, because without something beyond himself to give himself to, a family, a mission, a community, a God, the self becomes its own only reference point, and the self is not a stable anchor. The self shifts, it gets sick, it doubts, it wakes up in the dark and cannot name the reason it should get up. A man needs a North Star that exists outside of him, something that asks something of him, something that does not change based on how he feels on a Thursday, something he is accountable to and that he would be ashamed to disappoint. And then, only then, does the question of character become answerable. What kind of man do the people closest to you see when no one is performing? Not in the highlights, not in the photograph. What kind of man were you when it was hard, when you were tired, when you had every reason to take the easier path, and you had to choose? That question is the beginning of real identity construction. It cannot be accelerated. It cannot be surgically installed. It can only be answered over time, through action, through the slow and often unglamorous work of becoming a person you can respect, not in the mirror, but in your own memory. A man who is genuinely building in this direction will eventually stop being so preoccupied with how he reads to strangers. Not because appearance stops mattering, but because he will have found something real to care about. And what is real, over time, always crowds out what is proxy. There is a passage in the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 7, where Jesus describes two men and what they built. One builds his house on sand, the other builds on rock. For a time, both houses appear identical. Both structures stand. You cannot tell them apart by looking at them from the outside. Then the rain comes. The flood rises. The wind beats against both houses. The house on the sand collapses. The house on the rock stands. Most men right now are building on sand, not because they are foolish, not because they don't want to get it right, but because no one has shown them where the rock is. Scripture has a word for the foundation of a man's identity. That word is imago Dei, made in the image of God. Before you accomplish anything, before you built anything, before you had a jawline or a physique or a metric by which the culture measures a man's value, you were made as the image of something infinite. That is not a small thing to carry. That is a massive inheritance. And a man who actually understands it will relate to himself and to his work and to the people around him completely differently. Psalm 139 says, "I am fearfully and wonderfully made." The word fearfully in the Hebrew carries the weight of awe. Standing before something so vast and sovereign that your own smallness becomes vivid. The psalmist is not saying he feels confident. He is saying that the act of being made at all is staggering, that it demands reverence that has nothing to do with how he looks. A man who understands that he is made in the image of God does not need to sculpt himself into something more valuable. He needs to become a worthy steward of what he has already been given. He needs to ask not what he can look like, but what he is for. Not how he will be perceived, but what he will build, who he will serve, and what will remain when he is gone. That is a completely different project. That is the project of a man who has found the rock and decided to build there. And the storm, when it comes, will not take that man's house. Here is the one thing I want you to do today. Find one place in your life where you have been trying to solve an interior problem with an exterior fix. One place where you have been adjusting the surface rather than rebuilding the foundation. One place where you have been optimizing the image instead of constructing the character. Name it, write it down if you need to, and then ask this. What would it look like to address the actual thing, not the surface, the thing underneath? What would a man who is building on rock do in this place instead of what you have been doing? You are not what you look like. The mirror cannot answer the question you are actually asking. You are what you are building, in private, consistently, over time, in service of something real. Say that aloud if you need to. Gentlemen, I hope you take this to heart, what I'm saying, because truly living it, it'll change your life and the life of the people around you. So go live it, love it, and go be legendary.